As now constituted, presidential contests, focused almost exclusively on the candidates of the two major parties, are worse than useless in furnishing any opportunity for national debate. Consider the number of issues on which there is tacit agreement between the Republican and Democrat parties, either as a matter of principle or with an expedient nod and wink, that, beyond pro forma sloganeering, these are not matters suitable to be discussed in any public forum. The role of the Federal Reserve, trade policy, economic redistribution, the role and budget of the CIA and other intelligence agencies, almost all military, nuclear disarmament, reduction of the military budget and the allocation of military procurement, roles and policies of the World Bank, IMF, WTO, crime, punishment, and the prison explosion, the war on drugs, corporate welfare, energy policy, forest policy, the destruction of small farmers and ranchers, Israel, the corruption of the political system, the occupation of Iraq. The most significant outcome of the electoral process is usually imposed on prospective voters weeks or months ahead of polling day, namely the consensus between the supposed adversaries as to what is off the agenda. That was written by our guest, Alexander Cockburn, in the New Left Review for September-October 2004. Alexander Cockburn has lived in the United States since 1973 and is one of the foremost journalists and opinion makers on the left. He writes for The Nation and his own website, counterpunch.com. He is also the author, with Jeffrey St. Clair, of the books Whiteout, The CIA, Drugs, and the Press, Al Gore, A User's Manual, The Politics of Anti-Semitism, 5 Days That Shook the World, Imperial Crusades, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia, and their latest, Dime's Worth of Difference, Beyond the Lesser of Two Evils. Welcome to the show, Alexander Cockburn.
Glad to be with you.
It's an honor to have you on the show, sir.
Okie dokes. Here we are, rolling up towards Seattle. If we break up occasionally, it's because I'm in a car.
All right. Well, if we lose you, then I'll just stall for time, and we'll call you right back if we have any problems. Now, the reason I read that paragraph from your article in the New Left Review was because it could have been written by a libertarian or a hardcore conservative, for that matter. And since the left and right so often team up against liberty, I like to point it out when we can come together for liberty.
Well, I welcome that. You're talking to one of the few people, or me and my colleague Jeffrey Sinclair on Counterpunch. By the way, that passage originally was an essay in Counterpunch, which is in our book, Dime's Worth of Difference, and then a slightly different version containing that paragraph ended up in New Left Review. But, you know, most of the left, if you start talking about forming any kind of alliance on certain issues with the patriot crowd or with libertarian, well, we can use the word right, they won't have any time for you. But we say to them, look, if you go to antiwar.com, for example, which is a popular website, as you probably know, that comes out of the libertarian side. You don't have to agree on everything, but the way we see it, we see eye to eye with kind of audience I think you might have on the war, on a lot of the controlling institutions of our society, whether it be the Federal Reserve or the banks, and also on issues of freedom of speech and the Bill of Rights. And we feel that we can form common cause, but I can tell you that very often we find people like, for example, in your state, great state of Texas, we quite often feature on our website Representative Ron Paul.
All right. Hey, that's a good place to leave it as we go out to this break. We'll be right back with Alexander Cockburn on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and our guest this hour is Alexander Cockburn. And when we went to break, we were talking about the value of a left-right, it's an emerging, I should say, left-right libertarian alliance in the battle for liberty. And as we were going out to break, Mr. Cockburn, you were mentioning that you often run the writings of last week's guest, Representative Ron Paul from District 14 here in Texas, on your site, counterpunch.com.
Yeah, we're big admirers of Representative Paul. He said he's been a lonely voice. And when you look in the Congress, very often there may be 5 or 6 people who will be there in a crucial vote on Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly issues, and Representative Paul is usually one of them. But you said, I'm afraid you may be a little optimistic, Scott. You said the growing alliance between the right and the left on issues of liberty. I'm not so sure we see it growing from where we stand. We feel pretty lonely here on the left. We've been saying, for example, for the last year on the Kerry-Bush race, so-called, hey, wait a minute. Kerry's not, we said to a lot of our audience, Kerry's not so great, and I don't need to go through the litany of terrible votes he's done with you. You probably had it out with your readers many a time, your audience, I mean, many a time.
Well, we can go over some of that later.
Yeah, well, you know it. But when we look at people who are prepared, to even say someone like Ralph Nader has the right to run, whether or not you totally agree with 100% of his positions, on the left, you tend to hear a deafening silence. And what they really mean is they don't think he has a right to run because he's not going to end up folding and saying vote for the Democrat. It's a pretty thin line here from where we speak.
Well, that's true, and I think that goes really for most people of all political descriptions, that they don't think anybody ought to be able to do what they don't like. And
no,
that just kind of goes across the board. Although, as far on the optimism thing, though, I think sites like yours and, as you mentioned, antiwar.com show that you really can have an article by Alexander Cockburn and Pat Buchanan and Jacob Hornberger all on the same page saying the same thing. The correct thing.
This is true, but, I was just this morning, I was looking at, pulling down some email, and I have an article right up there this week on our homepage, counterpunch.org or .com, in which I was saying the polls seem to be telling us what? It's down to the wire. You can't tell which guy's going to win. And I was saying, has there ever been a candidate who had a more fortunate year than John Kerry? Here we are in the middle of a war which is widely unpopular. We have an economy which is doing very badly. Economic statistics are terrible. The last economic numbers they published before the election, which is the beginning of this month, are still bad. You've had troops mutinying in Iraq. You had the report at the beginning of this month from the Iraq Weapons Group, a government group, saying that definitely there are no weapons of destruction. In other words, the news has all been going Kerry's way.
And yet he can't make any hay out of it at all. Why is that?
He can't make a single haystack out of it. And why? Because people, I think, see him for what he is. They see him for a guy who had one good line in the third debate. He said the guy's been in the Senate for 20 years and he hasn't done anything. And he hasn't. It's quite true. And people look at him and they think he's a very privileged guy. He's married to a billionaire wife. He's got 6 fine houses. He can move around. He can spend 2 months in each house and see a new front door every 2 months. People don't like that stuff. In the end, it's in their bones. I mean, there is a populist streak in most Americans. And he can't make anything out of it.
And despite the fact that Bush's background is the same as John Kerry's, he comes across as a regular guy, whereas John Kerry does not.
That's absolutely true. And anyway, we have this up on the homepage. Bimbo, I opened the page, my email, and here's a fellow writing in saying, yet another guy giving the pass to John Kerry. His eyes are so habituated to seeing left-wing people say Kerry's a great guy that he couldn't actually read what was in front of him. I wrote back saying, talk about knee-jerk. You are a knee-jerk. You're not reading and listening to people who have a clear year of saying that John Kerry is mostly, or pretty much entirely, a false alarm.
And this really goes to the heart of the matter, doesn't it? That people they can't even, not only will they not listen to you when you're disagreeing with them, they won't even hear you agree with them if they don't think that you're agreeing with them in the first place. They just won't even, they can't even hear it.
You go to a meeting, they throw you to the ground, they're beating on you, and you say, but I agree with you, I agree with you. And their eyes are bloodshot with fury, and they can't hear a word. Not like your audience, of course.
Oh, very unlike them, I'm sure.
Your audience are
now
keen-minded.
To get to exactly what sort of SOB John Kerry has done, I got to say, I wish that George Bush was telling the truth when he said that John Kerry's done nothing. I would love for any politician to go to Washington, D.C. and do nothing except maybe repeal stuff. But what John Kerry has done is he's voted for every totalitarian piece of legislation for 20 years.
Oh, well, sure. He voted for the crime bill in the early 90s. He voted for the Effective Death Penalty and Counterterrorism Act in the middle 90s. He voted for the first war in Iraq. He voted for the second war in Iraq, and then he jumped back over the fence. And then I think he's a blur of movement. You can't tell which side of the fence he is on that one. Except he has finally said that, yes, he is in favor of a wider war in Iraq, and he's in favor, if necessary, of going on and bombing Tehran. I say to people on the left, I said, you're anti-war, right? And they say, yes, we're anti-war. I said, well, how can you actually bring yourself to vote for a guy who, you have to say for Kerry, he's not concealed his intentions here. How can you go out and say you're going to vote for a guy who's going to vote for a wider war? And they say, oh, he doesn't mean what he says. It's a wilderness of mirrors out there.
Well, and you know what the real problem is that if they vote for Michael Badnarik, the Libertarian, or for Ralph Nader, that they know that they're not going to do better than a couple of percent, and that if it has to be one or the other, at least it's not the incumbent.
Well, that's a pretty miserable way of looking at things. So you say,
it
okay,
sure is.
We've got two people who say we're going to take Americans and send them out to the battleground in Iraq, and one of them says, I'm going to try and bring you home maybe by Christmas if the elections work, which nobody believes they will. And the other guy says, no, furthermore, I'm going to increase the size of the armed forces by a couple of divisions, which means a draft. And they say, well, that guy, that's the lesser of two evils. This is what the left say. This is what the left is saying. And there's no way it can ever make sense. And then in that case, of course, we're excluding which state you happen to be in. I mean, you're in Texas. Where, the Republican's going to win, and where I'm speaking to you from Washington, where the Democrat's going to win. But even in these states, even in Washington or California, you've got people for Kerry who say, even though they think Kerry actually will widen the war, and not a word he says can be trusted, they still won't go and vote for the Libertarian or vote for Leonard Peltier or vote for whoever it might be. They're that locked up mentally.
Yeah, it's really bad news too. And you know what you say about talking about threatening Tehran, that's something that really struck me during the debates, was that basically George Bush was trying to spend the whole debate saying, well, I'm a socialist too. Well, I'm a socialist too. And John Kerry was spending the whole debate saying, well, I'm a warmonger too. I'm a warmonger too. And they're trying to outflank each other on their supposed opposite sides.
Yeah, I'll tell you something interesting on this view now. In the American Conservative magazine,
Pat Buchanan's magazine,
published by Pat Buchanan, I was just reading yesterday, they cannot agree on an endorsement, so they've been publishing, I don't know, maybe you've been over this with your audience, but they have individual endorsements. And one fellow called Scott something or other endorsed Kerry. Why? Because he said George Bush he likened him to Leon Trotsky, which probably is the first time the charge of being a Trotskyite has ever been leveled at George Bush.
Oh, I don't know. You must not read antiwar.com that much.
Oh, really? I must have missed the articles calling him a Trotskyite.
Well, actually, what they usually talk about is the neoconservatives, who many of whom are ex-Trotskyites, who are in the third-level policy position.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
George Bush himself, I don't know if he's
George
really
Bush does not seem to me to resemble Leon Trotsky. I don't know. Maybe
I don't think he could read a Trotsky book, probably.
He couldn't read a Trotsky book. Well, he probably couldn't. I think he probably would not be able to read a Trotsky. Let's stipulate he couldn't read a Trotsky book. But
he could sit still and get a briefing on it, probably.
Well, a two-page briefing, like many other people who think they know Trotsky. But anyway, let's get back to it. This guy said that there's George Bush. He is one of the most radical presidents in history. And he said, well, I'm going to suggest a vote for Kerry because Kerry will be a rather weak one-term president, and during that period, the conservative movement can regroup, presumably do battle to the death with the neocons, and get them out of the way, and then we'll have a revived Republican Party based on proper principles of patriotism, independence, freedom from war. Maybe we'll hang the chairman of the Federal Reserve and all the rest of the nice things that the libertarians dream of when they're at home and locked away, and that'll be that. Now, that seems to me, you try and find a leftist who would write, say, in The Nation magazine, I hope George Bush wins because there's only one more term to go, and after 2 years he'll be a lame duck, as he himself admitted. And John Kerry is just going to be a son of empire, and his role, his divinely appointed role, as he himself likes to think, because he says he's more or less permanent communication with God, he says he's going to be planning to put the empire on a more orderly footing. That's what John Kerry sells himself out. He says, I will run a better empire. Now,
that's right, a better empire. All right, everybody, stay tuned. We're going out to break. We'll be right back with Alexander Cockburn and Kerry's Better Empire. Welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and the guest is Alexander Cockburn. He's the author of the book Dimes Worth of Difference, Beyond the Lesser of Two Evils, and runs the website counterpunch.com. We're talking about stupid Bush and stupid Kerry and this stupid fake election between these two warmonger doofuses. And I was thinking during the break there, Mr. Cockburn, that really, I know that ever since Vietnam that the left has, more or less had a monopoly on being the side of American politics that opposes war. But really, warmongering seems to really be a Democratic tradition. If you look back in history, from Jackson, Polk, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon Johnson. And it sort of seems like when Bush goes and gives his speeches about world revolution and spreading democracy because it's the will of God and that kind of thing, that really he sounds a lot like Woodrow Wilson. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. I mean, you named the major names. I mean, that's just in more recent history. I mean, people now tend to forget. Oh, well, not everybody. Bill Clinton, one of the big wars of Clinton time was in Yugoslavia. I mean, there wasn't a liberal leftist that wasn't on board for that one. They swallowed every gobbet of propaganda and all the deceptions, which were not, by the way, nearly as methodically exposed as the WMDs have been in Iraq, although my co-editor, I, and Jeffrey Sinclair, we did a book which goes right through that called Imperial Crusades, which any of your audience can find up on our website, counterpunch.org. They bought that one. They love war. You're absolutely right.
And that was completely based on falsehoods, wasn't it? The mass graves and all that.
I have to warn you, Scott, you may lose me in a minute. We're about to enter a tunnel in Seattle.
Oh, no.
Not a tunnel of ignorance, but a concrete tunnel.
Okay, well, try to take the high road around it if you can.
We'll take the high road around it if we can, but I think we're about to go down. But still.
All right. Well, hey, I want to bring up something that was just killing me all week. I just have not been able to get over this. Did you read the article by Ron Susskind in the New York Times Magazine last Sunday?
Sure did.
About George Bush is absolutely out of his mind. He's the most isolated emperor in the history of North America.
Yeah, I read that article. I thought that was kind of very limp stuff. It was like, as my co-editor Jeffrey said to me, he said, those are the bits he didn't even get into his book on O'Neill. It was pretty feeble stuff. Or did you think it was,
the part of it that really stuck to me was the part where nobody ever has an argument in front of George Bush. I mean, when I imagine a typical, TV character president who doesn't exist, the president is supposed to sit there while the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense have an argument, and then he's supposed to decide. But what I'm learning from this is that Bush never had, there's no debate ever. He doesn't ask any questions. He doesn't have any real briefings. He's not interested in what's going on in the world at all.
What's new? I mean, people didn't have an argument in front of Bill Clinton because they couldn't get a word in edgeways. And with Reagan, do you think people stood there arguing in front of Reagan? Of course they didn't.
No, I
guess not. They had a little memo, and they gave him a memo. That's what amazes me about people about Bush. Not just that. I mean, people tend not to have arguments in front of the president. One of the great joys and beauties of being president is that you don't have to listen to people yakking away in front of you. You have it all in a memo. You can sit there and read the paper in your office or read whatever nonsense the CIA sends you every morning, and you don't have to listen to them. I mean, but the thing, more seriously, people say we've never been, this is what you tend to hear on the liberal side, there has never been a moment of greater peril in the history of the nation than there is with George Bush. The man's a madman, he's a maniac, he's going to drag us all into war. I mean, where have these people been? Ronald Reagan, by the way, thought that the end was going to come in his own lifetime. If you go back and look in the Eisenhower years when Dulles was running foreign policy, we were within, 1 minute of nuclear obliteration a couple of times.
Yeah, those
these days, the Dulles brothers, we could go into the Dulles brothers and the law firms that they worked for in New York. I mean, the idea somehow, people on these election times, they forget history. Completely. They forget we have been here before many times.
Well, and in just recent history, something of yours that I read just in the last couple of days, you talked about how Clinton killed far more civilians than George Bush has.
Well, yeah, if you factor in Rwanda, when they were warned that there was a genocide about to happen in Rwanda, and the Clinton people said, we want to keep the focus, this is their words, we want to keep the focus on Yugoslavia. And so how many people died in Rwanda? You pick your count.
Well,
but it was
I'm not sure neglecting to intervene counts as killing, but I was thinking if you added up all the people who died from the sanctions in Iraq and the wars in the Balkans.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't know. You can count Rwanda in or not, and you may not. I mean, that gets us into long debates about the UN, which I'd be happy to have. But even if the UN is effectively dead as an institution, and probably most of your audience think it never should have been born in the first place.
Yeah, well, I hope that's true. I wish that it was the debating society they sold it as, but unfortunately I perceive it as a federal government, and I don't like it.
Yeah, you're right. They said it's a debating society on the one hand. On the other hand, it's an instrument of U.S. foreign policy, which it mostly was. But, yeah, sure, just stay with Yugoslavia if you want. Stay with sanctions in Iraq. I mean, what is it? What's the count in Iraq? You take your pick. 600,000 people, mostly kids, basically finished off by sanctions.
I'm still trying to figure out why they didn't greet us with flowers and candy.
Flowers and candy. Well, and of course, the way they run the whole thing is absolutely insane. People could see it coming a mile away.
Oh, we're going out to break again. Everybody stay tuned.
Say goodbye, Scott.
Oh, you're going in the tunnel. All right, we'll try to get back in touch with Alexander Cockburn. It's the Weekend Interview Show on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
We'd like to say a particular hello to Tamara Ray. Alia Ray here wants to say hello to her daughter, Tamara, who is outside Austin. And I say hello to your fine audience. I hope we can talk again.
Great. Yeah, we'll try to call you right back here in a minute.
No.